All right, we still have a few trickling in, but we're at our start time. Cool, okay. If we get a few more, that's great. I'll just say a little welcome again for anyone who is new. Welcome. And if you're interested in knowing what happened the last couple of days, that's all been recorded and I've sent it out in links. And I'll do that again today. Today we're focusing on planning and the policy side of things. General housekeeping stuff, if you're unfamiliar with anything, you would have gotten a little pop-up saying we're recording this. When we get into breakout rooms, those are not recorded, so don't worry about that. Say whatever you like in there. And if you have any questions, we have a chat. The chat is open. And at the end of this presentation in the beginning, you can also ask questions after that. Any other questions that come up about anything at all, keep them in mind because tomorrow we're going to have a panel and you can ask anyone, any of these facilitator people, or we had some guests earlier in the week that are going to come back. You can also raise your hand, that is under reactions. And one thing that we want to point out today, so yesterday we went into breakout rooms as we did on Tuesday as well. Yesterday we're doing the setup in the morning. Jeff is behind the scenes getting everyone arranged. And if you're not planning to stay for the breakout room, it would be better to let us know now, because when we make the groups, we try to put so many in there, but then we had some drop off later yesterday. So then it ended up being some rooms had more, some rooms had less. So just let us know that. You can put in the chat directly to me or Jeff, and that would just be helpful for us for the planning. But in general, we are also kind of rearranging it today. We were anticipating a few less in terms of registrants. So we're going to do 3 rooms instead of the 6 that we had. So hopefully we'll have some better numbers in there. I think that's all that I had to say, and I can pass that to Ashley unless you can think of something else I'm supposed to say.
That's great, Emma. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks again for coming to the Community Climate Resilience and Adaptation, Building Capacity and Expertise Collaboratively conference. For anyone who is joining us just for today, I think there was a few folks that signed up only for today. So I am Ashley Smith from Fundamental Inc. Fundamental was engaged by Memorial University and Joe Durayo to support the development of BRACE program activities. So it's building resilience and adaptive capacity and expertise. It's a big old mouthful. And it's a project funded by Natural Resources Canada that's being delivered in partnership with Memorial University, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, PEG NL, Engineers Canada, Municipalities NL, and NLAB. So today, we are going to talk about planning and policy and eco-asset management. Although quite devastating, I find this picture quite evocative in the sense that adaptation, mitigation, and asset management can't really be taken in isolation. They are connected concepts. And I feel for these people. I always imagine like that water is over people's heads, I suspect, based on what's there. And that in trying to identify solutions, we kind of have to look at all 3 at the same time, which can be a complex exercise. So this particular conference and these set of days has been largely targeted at the municipal level, in the sense that municipalities have a responsibility for a lot of things, and they're often the sort of level of government where a lot of the decision making around climate change is being delegated to, which can be an opportunity, but also quite an incredible challenge. Municipalities have a responsibility for a lot of things, none the least of which is where development happens, how development happens, levels of service around key aspects for provision of services for public safety, oftentimes potable water, either through management of groundwater or an actual potable water piped infrastructure, wastewater management, how waste gets collected and managed, what happens during emergencies, and many, many more things. These were just sort of the top ones that came to mind when it comes to municipalities being in a position to make good quality decisions around adaptive capacity building and climate change. And so I mean, everyone's heard this, like, how do you eat an elephant? Especially one that might be a bit ornery and hard to define. And it's about process. So we talked on Tuesday about that there were many, many frameworks available to try and look at how a community can go through a climate change adaptation process. This is something that Fundamental has come up with because we've found that it works very well for the communities that we've worked with. Fundamental has been fortunate enough to work with, I don't know, somewhere around 30 to 40 communities in the last 4 years, directly and indirectly, to deliver um, climate change plans. And so in looking at this, this is structured to give people the one bite at a time approach, right? So in order for us to get to an action plan and get to a place where we can start to implement some of these actions, there is a fair amount of data and information that needs to be collected, that needs to be internalized into institutional knowledge, and then one can develop an action plan. And so from our perspective, there's sort of three main categories that are required to be able to articulate a climate lens across organizational decision making. And so that's taking an asset management view in a fairly traditional sense, with some climate change modifications in there that we'll talk about. Looking at resilience and adaptation, so looking at projected climate change impacts, what scenarios and risk tolerance so we're willing to accept, assessing vulnerability and finding potential options for that. So we started with that yesterday from an engineering perspective, and we'll continue on with that today from a planning perspective. But then also connecting emissions mitigation planning, so that there's the whole mantra that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And there although I don't know that I would call that dogma precisely, there is a lot of truth to how that happens, and the logic about how that gets executed through process. And in this instance, if the town is looking at a zero carbon future, the only way to do that is to start to calculate your emissions, understand how they contribute to climate change, and being able to make like low carbon and resilient options and choices going forward. So, and once you've sort of got all these pieces in place, that's when you can do like a cross evaluation exercise where you get all the information you have in one place. So we call this a climate conscious decision matrix, and we can go through. And that's when you can develop the action plan. And so with anything, when you're planning, right, like you need to aim at something. And so we've talked a lot in the last few days about the uncertainty of data and information that we have and how you make decisions in the context of that level of uncertainty. And that often it's less about having like a quote unquote right answer or like the only thing that's right, and more about like what level of tolerance you're willing to accept, or like what level of potential consequence you're looking at risking. And so we've talked SSP and RCP, and what those are. Like, so it's less important to know exactly what those mean and more important just to understand that they're like, it's a way to look at scenarios of the future. And so this is from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN's body that pulls together the world's like top scientists. the biggest brains and cleverness we have to do climate modeling and address climate issues. And so graphs like this that are really technical are sometimes a bit hard to absorb. So I'm going to sort of pull out the two like key salient things that we need to understand about this. And I'll start with the bottom. And so if we think about what's happening here as a carbon budget, right? So in the same sense as a dollar budget. So this blue one is if we take a lot of action, it's like the best case scenario, and then we're going to spend only this much carbon, right? So like as an analogy, that's a clear understanding. So we're only spending that much. So if we continue on with business as usual, we don't take a lot of action, things, like we don't put a lot of emphasis on this, then we're going to spend this burgundy row of carbon. And so one can see that if you, again, with the analogy of money, because intuitively, I think most people like understand that on a bit like more internalized level. So if you spend this much carbon, then you only have to adapt to this much climate change, right? So the impacts are going to be different. So if you'll recall from Joel's presentation on Monday, he talked about how there's a certain amount of climate change that's already baked in. So no matter what we do at this point, there's no getting the banana back out of the banana bread in any form or shape of a banana. And there's just certain things we're going to have to do regardless. Like there's a baseline of change that we're going to have to adapt to. So if we spend this blue line, then that doesn't change a whole lot from what we're going to, like what we know we have to adapt to now. If we spend this burgundy one, like this is the scenario where we start to get into like ecosystem and like physical, like planetary level collapse of systems, which is problematic, especially if you live on an island state, or are a panda or a koala and eat only one thing ever. So, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that, that's not ideal. We would like to avoid that. And so best practice sort of right now is that we sort of try and target like this dark blue or the like goldenrod color, but that from an adaptive perspective, you sort of aim for the red, which is just sort of like an industry decision about aiming for the middle. And you can decide whether you agree with that or not as an individual town or that kind of thing. But that's the logic. So like when we're talking about what are we adapting to, how do we plan, how do we make decisions within a context of uncertainty, like this is the concept here, and the concept that mitigation and adaptation are connected. And so when we're looking at planning and policy, we have to recognize that you kind of have to hit both ends of that candle, because we're burning both of them, and we're trying not to burn the candle down as far as possible. And from our perspective, the only pathway that I can see to make that happen is to go from isolated decision making for each of the categories that a municipality is responsible for to integrated decision making. Now, integrate like the precise mechanic or tactic about how you do that to go from isolated to integrated, like there's a few different options for that, and we're going to go through one that fundamentally uses because we have found it to be effective, and hopefully that will give you a solid enough understanding of like what you're aiming at, that you can use that as sort of foundational understanding and going forward. But the idea that the transportation engineer designs the road, and then the stormwater management engineer designs the culvert and the piped things. And then some other engineer probably designs the potable water delivery. If you're in a well system, often there's groundwater modeling, but the groundwater modeling is not always like consistent or continuous. So it may or may not give you a clear understanding of actually how much groundwater is in there. Wastewater treatment is one of those things where, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's a kind of hot button topic. There's lots of folks who don't meet federal wastewater requirements. There's lots of folks who are right on the edge. There's often a bit of tension between like what the town wants and how they get municipal capital works funding for specific projects. There's some things in there. but that often happens in isolation of anything else, right? Same with buildings, same with fleet, same with recreation, same with solid waste management. Most of these decisions are made in isolation from each other with specialists within each of those things. And so one of the key aspects that we are trying to emphasize over the course of this week is the collaborative nature and collaborative approach that like we have determined is required to start to look at things, right? So when you start to look at how decisions are made about a community energy strategy and what policies are available to make sure that we don't continue to contribute to climate change, and how that connects then with electrification overall. So looking at how that electrifies the fleet and how we look at a transportation strategy that de-emphasizes vehicles, how you look at public transportation in a rural setting. And then with the connection of, I mean, roads are often the thing that gets washed out when we have major storm events, and how you sort of look at, well, how are roads and then water management connected? And is there a way that we can integrate those in a way that increases resilience of a system, reduces the possibility of catastrophic failure? And when you start to look at how rainwater is managed, that starts to come into the connection with like how the overall stormwater is sort of pulled into the ground and then gets connected to food security and what that means for a waste strategy and reduction. And again, a sort of tongue-in-cheek thing is that if you just cut here, we get to a sustainable infrastructure. I mean, it's one of those things that I like because on the one hand, you can see technologically, it's actually pretty straightforward and simple, but from an implementation standpoint and a management of expectation standpoint, it can be very tricky. So again, the sort of key concept being like that we need to go from isolated to integrated with our decision making. So going back to the sort of generalized process, this specific process has been taken from a project that we did this year with a cohort of communities in Conception Bay Central. And so what we did is go through every single one of these. So these are individual reports that then have to be combined into a climate conscious decision matrix, and then we can get to an implementation action plan. So I'll go through sort of each of the steps. So with asset management, you do the same thing as you always would. You do your asset inventory, you do a condition assessment, you do a level of service review, and you do a state of the infrastructure review. And you can do that from a probability standpoint, to like risk and revenue standpoint. You can do any of those things. You do them all because money is always a key factor in how something gets decided. And to ignore that would be folly. So we start there. This also gets us to a place where you can kind of double dip in the sense that it's going to be required for gas taxes, I understand. Kathleen can correct me on that if I'm wrong. And so it's one of those things. Doing this also gets you in general, like a foundational GIS model, which can then be layered with what you look at when you're doing adaptation. So you have to research what your projected climate impacts are for your community. You then do, it's important, and I don't know if anybody else, I think others discussed in the group, but we certainly emphasized in ours how important it is to get resident engagement so that you're taking a bottom-up approach and everyone feels as though they're part of the process and understands. And then the data that you often need to make a risk decision is based on lived experience within that space, being part of that evidence base. To include with the modeled projected impacts. So you do that vulnerability assessment with your community, and then you do an integrated watershed model. So often this starts with like just the land side, and then can be built out to include the ocean side. And there's, again, getting down to mechanics, there's specific softwares that like you can build on with the modules. So if you start with the right software, you can continue to build on it, which is just a strategy going forward. But the idea that from an adaptation perspective, these are the pieces that you need to understand to identify where your vulnerabilities are, and be able to model out scenarios associated with things that we know are going to have the highest impact. So it's like the coastal issues and the stormwater issues. And then the third sort of category of component is the mitigation. So you do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory from a corporate perspective. We will often include as like indirect emissions associated things, like potable water use or wastewater treatment isn't, even if it isn't directly controlled by the community, or like even if it isn't controlled by the legal entity of the municipality, even if you sort of buy it somewhere else, and we also include like waste generation of all the households, which again isn't isn't directly the result of emissions of the incorporated entity of the municipality operating, right? So like where you draw your boundary around what constitutes the town. But we'll include those strategically because that allows for the town who has influence over, do you do a water conservation program? Do you do a recycling blitz? Those kinds of things. So the town has influence over those things. And so that's the one side of it from the sort of capacity building and public outreach perspective. And the other reason we do that is because then you can put a climate lens on categories of things that you would not normally be able to access funding for. So like waste is considered operational. You can't normally get capital funding for that or something. But if you use a climate lens, you can say if we put in this project, we'll have an emissions reduction of this much. And so then you have like a clear climate justification for putting the project in that also has like social and economic benefits to the town. So once you take all of these things and put them together, you essentially put it into a climate conscious decision matrix. So that is a fancy name. It's a bit jargony, but like I was trying to get something that would fit on a slide. Essentially what that means is put all your information in one place so that when you're trying to make a decision about something, you have multiple perspectives on the decision that it is that you're trying to make. And it puts you in a position that you can optimize between level of service requirements, vulnerability reduction, and low emissions going forward, right? So like it puts that all in the place that you can get your brain to understand, how do I hit the lowest possible value on all of those things? And then that's when you can get to an implementation plan, because once you understand sort of what it is that needs to be done, then you can start to prioritize. And so here is an example of a climate conscious decision matrix that Fundamental has used multiple times. And so when you look at this is how you, and I mean, it's big, and I mean, I suppose borderline unwieldy until you like get your face and eyes into it kind of situation. But it's the only way we have found to date that you can kind of get all of the criteria that we feel a town needs to make a good climate conscious decision for infrastructure and planning and policy and development and land use, all of the things that a town is responsible for. And so when you start to break down the individual things, you look at an asset category, you look at your standard asset management stuff, like the average physical condition, is it meeting your level of service expectations? What's that total asset value? What's the annual reserve that's required to make sure you can upgrade it in the future? And like, what are the sort of cost budget estimate considerations you need to figure out when going forward and maintaining a reserve for future? So it's got that piece. Then it's got the adaptation piece, where you start to look at the climate projections, the vulnerabilities, general adaptation recommendations, and then if there's specific risks or hazards that come up as a part of your review, then that's there. And then from a mitigation perspective, you start to look at like what emissions are associated with how it currently functions. Is there an opportunity to reduce that in future as you replace or as you go forward? Is there other like emissions or embodied carbon or other environmental impact considerations that are associated with this going forward, right? So this is here. So um, anyone at Fundamental has spent a lot of time working with this. And so there, this is sort of something we live and breathe every day. But what I was hoping is I can give you an example of how this would get filled out. And so we'll go through a couple of examples. So this is for like a municipal piped wastewater infrastructure system. So if we go through, like you do your average physical condition the same way you would do for any traditional asset management strategy. And in this case, it's pretty good. And are we meeting level of service expectations overall? No, because we're not in compliance with federal wastewater regulations. We should often there's some gray area with that. So, we have it there to confirm. What are the relevant climate projections associated with your wastewater infrastructure? In this case, it's combined storm sewer. And so increases in precipitation and intensity and overall and duration is going to be an issue. The outfalls are fairly low by, climate projected standards. And so we're looking at the potential that like the outfall could be covered. So those are the climate projections that we care about in relation to wastewater infrastructure. There may be some more, but in terms of just making sure it functions on a basic level, these are some things. And so then we talk about those overall climate vulnerabilities, right? So the issues with combined storm sewer, the issues with coastal outfalls. There are some septic systems along the coastal areas, and that like those could get inundated, which would be problematic if that land gets flooded and the water table comes up, then the septic system will back up. It just won't work because it needs to go in one direction, which is away from your house. And that doesn't always happen if the ocean is coming at your house. So those are the vulnerabilities that were identified. And then we start to talk about, okay, so what are some general adaptation recommendations? So consider opportunities for constructed wetland solutions, excuse me, based on a watershed approach to address the stormwater and the wastewater. Constructed wetlands have a much higher resiliency to major changes in volume associated with a storm event, and also a higher level of resilience associated with a lower BOD. So like the amount, like the strength of the wastewater, it could go from very weak to very strong, and the wetland is still able to manage it. So look at that. This is connected to doing the watershed study and how that influences the stormwater, wastewater, engage the public to see how they feel about this, how it might fit, what land is available, and then identify contingency plans if the whole thing goes shiny side down. And then specifically looking at emissions information, you look at, okay, so there's emissions associated with an ocean outfall. There's emissions associated with private septic system operation. There's emissions associated with electricity use at the lift stations. And so you add those together and you have a total, and then you understand where you sit. And so generally speaking, if you're looking at low carbon recommendations, engineered wetland systems are low emissions and they sequester carbon. Conventional systems use significant energy and produce sludge that has to be landfilled. These are the things that need to be understood when making a decision for future management of your wastewater. And then again, we sort of get back to the money. Like, what does this look like? How much money do we need for total renewal? What's our target annual reserve? How long away might that be? You could add that in here. And then just sort of general considerations for long-term planning and operations. And this is going to be probably pretty town specific. Anyone who's involved in operating the system is going to have knowledge that no one else is going to have about what works and what doesn't and when that system has trouble. So this is the idea here where you start to go across and you can see that all of that information, so it takes all of those reports that you can boil down and drill down and drill down and drill down, and then you can get this all in one place. And then you're able to sort of see everything in a level that you can wrap your brain around it in its entirety and go forward. So, oh, hang on, there we go. Okay. This is a bit small, and I apologize. There was just no other way to get a hold of it. So in this instance, this is a case where we were looking at stormwater and transportation infrastructure in a combined way, because in this particular community, every time there was a storm event, a bunch of their roads washed out. And so if you're going to address that issue, we felt that it would be important to kind of look at those things together. And then in this instance, because there was specific areas, so this was like, this is a service category overall, right? Is the stormwater and transportation infrastructure. And then there's a specific asset or a specific like physical area of the town to be concerned with. And so this was the case where we started looking at places individually. They have very different elevations. They have very different places in the watershed, and the natural hydrological, like the natural water movement from stormwater through the space. They had different zoning requirements. They had different things. And so then you start to look at each one of them individually, where the vulnerabilities, so like the table isn't completed. And so you look at vulnerabilities that are specific to this based on the climate projections that are more specific than the generalized climate vulnerabilities. You put a bit of a description in there so that if you have to explain to anyone or you need a table to put in a funding application, it's there, and anyone seeing it cold can get a bit better understanding of what's on the go. If there's a specific risk that you're looking at, which ties very closely with how you get to a project definition, and then looking at specific emissions considerations. And so this is the kind of part, these are the parts of the table that get completed in your first pass, like getting the information all in one place, looking at the data, getting it sorted. And these ones here, so prioritizing and looking at the action item, who is responsible, what's the timeline, cost estimate, budgeting considerations, funding opportunities, and then a current status. These are standard project management implementation plan things. Who is responsible for doing it? What timeline does it look like? And how much money do we need? Right? Those are standard things. And then we'll talk a little bit more about ways to prioritize when you have multiple quite heavy concerns going forward. You know, everything seems like it should be top priority, but you know, again, you have to eat that elephant one bite at a time, because it's just not possible to conjure an entire elephant into or out of existence. So this is sort of where we get to where all of that information is in one place. And so that was a lot of information that I just kind of threw at participants. And so we can make this, I mean, the slides and everything will be available afterwards for reference. But I hope that that sort of gave you a bit of an understanding for us to go into our activity here for today. I realize now that I'm actually a bit over time, and I apologize for that. But so going into the next step here, the two things that are sort of like that we identified are sort of critical to have in your minds going forward is the municipal asset categories, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying all of the things, stuff, physical things and processes that the municipality is responsible for. That's what that means. And then vulnerability areas, which again is a fancy way of saying like the things that could happen to us that would cause problems, right? So coastal stormwater, changing temperatures, all of the things that we've been talking about all this week. So if you sort of keep those in your mind as we go into our exercise, then we'll start to talk about how we can address things, and how is it that we start to adapt that climate lens onto organizational decision making. And we'll go through some thought exercises to try and figure out 4 specific vulnerabilities that were identified for our fictitious community. Like how would we change that? What's the process? So yeah, without further ado, let's get to it.
Okay. Oh, well, I was having a passion talk and then saw this pop up and I was like, I'll get rid of it. And instead of getting rid of it, I pressed leave the breakout room. So, you know, oh well.
Oh dear, Beth. Well, you're welcome to share it with the whole group. Everything I've ever heard you say.
I was just like, we're just going on. We were like having this big discussion about politics essentially, and how like we need to like, how it's really hard to get people who are making decisions to understand that like the things that we've been talking about here like really need to be part of the decision-making process. And like it's not enough to like do things the way we did before. So
I agree. If you're willing to share that with the whole group, I do think it would be a.
I mean, I think Emma will probably say it because like it was sort of a theme for her whole session.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Well, that's great. I think it would be to the edification and benefit of everyone to have you participate as well.
Sorry, group 2, I pressed the wrong button. Instead of getting rid of the box, I pressed.
That's okay.
All right. So are we all back? Jeff, Emma, are we all back in the group here?
We should be, yep.
I just want to apologize in advance for railroading our whole conversation. I just couldn't help it. It just all came out, right?
It was good. It
Sorry
was
if we
good.
lost focus on the exercise.
I think it was
Me
good.
too. Me too.
It's very surprising that Brian would do that. I mean, he's not like he's ever done that before. So.
Yeah, it's not the first time I've done that.
No,
I'm just messing with you.
the passion is welcome and necessary from my perspective. It's really important to care a lot and to bring that desire for beneficial progress to the table. It's always good. So we can start with room 1 then for the quick sharing of what was discussed.
You're muted, Kathleen.
Always do that. We started with our zone 1 option, which was the emergency center, and the the discussion around how to approach with a policy and planning lens a response to this, and we went through all the scenarios of whether we are looking at the scenario of building a new center and working for a period of time with the one that exists, and recognizing that there's a transition there. And we sort of pulled out some of the opportunities that exist in the context of the emergency plan, others that exist in terms of the long-term planning of the community, as well as some of the asset management linkages. But I think there was an interesting discussion there in terms of the critical path, and maybe I'll throw to Daniel, because that was something that you were quite interested in the context of how we move forward through a process of responding in policy terms. Daniel, are you still there?
Yeah, I think that was actually someone else in our group. I don't see his name. If you wanted to speak more to that, or if he's still here.
Oh, goodness, I'm sorry. I thought, who was it that spoke to the critical path then? All right. And then secondly, we tried to, I thought it would be nice if we actually made sure that we got in one of the inland examples for the second one. So we had a more extensive conversation there around some of the policy responses that relate to biodiversity and securing habitat there. So who from the group would like to speak to that one? Susan, perhaps?
Well, I don't have too much to speak to, but I work in environmental education, so it's the one that jumps out at me, and I would hope that it's something that whenever we talk about planning or any steps forward, that I mean, that could be considered catastrophic in some circles if there is any biodiversity loss that's unnecessary. So I think it should be first and foremost. Whatever's happening with the environment needs to be first and foremost. And you look at these big pictures and you think, I immediately think that's going to be the story for so many towns in Newfoundland and Labrador in the coming years, that the only option is really going to be relocation and new building and moving into these larger centers. So what does that look like? And is there policies in place to protect habitat and yeah, ensure there's the least amount of impact on the other creatures and the other ecosystems there.
Yes, and with that, there was definitely the interest in the group in the sort of the hybridizing the solutions between the hard engineered solutions, the ones that look more so to the nature-based solutions, and working that into policy in a much more deliberate fashion too. And taking full advantage of the knowledge of community as well, engaging the community in that planning process well, to both build awareness and traction, for the plans that are being made. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Kathleen. So we were group 2. I hardly know where to start. So it was it was a quite robust conversation. We had some varied perspectives. And all very a lot of educated perspectives, and with a lot of experience behind them. So we started looking at zone 4, but it very quickly kind of became a bigger picture conversation. And really what it came around to was how difficult it is for towns to make decisions alongside the public, and with different levels of understanding of issues, with different priorities, how there tends to be a lot of conflict in even the small decisions that towns make, and a lot of pushback. So when we're looking at these huge issues, what can we expect there? How do we even start? And what level of trying to balance the responsibility of a municipality to protect people with their right to live in wherever they want, or with their desire to preserve heritage versus our desire to preserve life, because they can be different, they can be counter to each other in the situations we're looking at. So how do we do that? Where do we draw lines in that kind of way? And does this all really come down to engagement in the end? We do, of course, need to have the plans, we need to have the policies, we need to sort that out, but it has to be paired with this communication. And I'm not sure how to summarize some of the other things. I'm zoomed out at my stickies and just realized how many there are. It's a little overwhelming. But we did talk about, we do have some stickies about actual things you could do. And we were focusing on the development plan in general, and how we could, what kind of, I guess, points we could put into that development policy related to zone 4 and zone 3. So there are a few of those stickies, but it really became this conversation around how do we enable these councils to make these choices, and how do we enable the community to be involved, and all of that kind of stuff. I know we're getting close to our normal time to close here. We have a few minutes left, so if anyone has something quick to say from our group, go ahead, and then we'll pass it to
I have something really
group.
quick, which is
Okay.
I think that we can't absolve the provincial government of responsibility here, and that part of our discussion was the really that municipalities have some really important powers, but also are very limited in lots of ways. And so the provincial government needs to be supporting municipalities and having capacity and resources, and enabling them to do what is best as they decide that.
Thanks, Beth.
We good? I want to chime in there, Emma, too, because I come from a very small town. I'm a new councillor to our town, and I couldn't talk on the Miro board at all. And I was here fair busting, wanting to speak.
Oh, were you trying to talk in Miro?
Yes.
Oh, we were just using the Zoom. Were you still listening to us?
I heard everything, but I couldn't
Okay.
say a word, and
Oh,
I'm busting a gut here.
it was yeah, you would have had to unmute in Zoom.
Oh, I apologize.
Okay. If you want to
just
talk
wanna make-
later, let me know.
Okay, because there's a lot of things, but just I want to quickly say that I mean, I come from a healthcare background, so all of these conversation, these words, this vernacular that you're using are really outside of my scope of knowledge. I mean, I consider myself an educated person, but then as you know, a volunteer within a small town with a council of 7. And like we said, so many of the decisions that we need to make are really outside of our scope of knowledge or even understanding of some of these very complex documents and decisions that come to us. And I found just in my brief year that, as like some of us have said, that a lot of these decisions were made looking through an economic lens versus an environmental lens. And here we are today in the town that I'm from, that the environment has massive implications and we have to make big decisions, but there are only several of us who are really kind of grasping that and wanting to move forward with it, but ourselves are very aware of our own lack of knowledge or capability perhaps to push these bigger things forward. So I agree. When I feel as just one member of 7 that not that I want to lose our autonomy as a town, but that we need to have more direction from the province of what needs to be done and more help from the province of how to do that.
Valerie, if I just ask you one question, like you were in our chat room, like you heard what I was saying about defending the counselors as people, as humans who are trying to make, like, how much did any of that resonate with you in your small town, like in your council colleagues?
Well, absolutely, because a previous council to the one I'm on right now actually made the news because there was just so much hostility within council itself, let alone the broader community. So one of the things that that myself as a new councillor and a couple other members really wanted to put into place right from the outset was a respectful workplace policy, just for councillors alone, because it was, you know, it was like Family Feud in this community, and councillors were eating councillors, let alone again the broader community. So this was something that well, like I said, I come from a healthcare background, and respectful workplace is certainly one of the tenets of that environment. And I just wanted this from the outset. This is how we are going to relate to each other as councillors. And then hopefully that mutually respectful environment will then translate into how, you know, what we're going to tolerate from the community and what the community is going to expect of us and from us. And so far, it hasn't been too bad. I'm sure when we make some really meaty decision, it will be. But, you know, we do get some conflict. But as long as we're treating each other respectfully and supporting each other in the decisions that we need to make, so far that I feel that has translated into my communications, at least within the community.
Thanks so much, Valerie. And I am really sad that we didn't sort out that mute button. So definitely touch base with us if you want to go over anything later.
Thank you so much.
And I guess Ashley, you're the last group.
We are. Excuse me. Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this discussion. Thank you for everyone who's participating. This is how we build collaborative capacity. Thank you very much. So our group, we looked at 2 specific vulnerabilities, one around the marina and the breakwater and what that looks like if there's issues with the breakwater. And then the second was around coastal erosion and landslide risk and the impact on tourism. So like we mostly looked at sort of zone 1 and zone 2, and those were sort of just picked at random, folks looked through. And so we talked very in a very structured way about like what that root cause was and how you address that root cause through a probability lens, a consequence lens, any kind of lens, right? Like how do you address that? And then like what physical changes need to be made in order to articulate the addressing of the vulnerability within the physical documents, right? So it was a discussion sort of focused on the mechanics of organizational lens shifting. And so we had extraordinary participation. We had multi-platform participation. Everyone sort of came together here. Sorry, my son is singing in the background. And so we had some really good things, including some understanding of how even in the shifting, you can take a, one door closes, another window opens kind of thing with it in some instances, right? And how valuable it is in order to kind of address those changes, and how the shifting works, and how a lot of the decisions around this are rooted in collaboration. So whether that's like a regional approach or a cohort approach, or the municipality working with an academic partner through MyTax, like the collaboration, how important that is. And also how important the community consultation is, so that you can frame like how you go forward. So you have to build that awareness and empathy with all of the levels of stakeholder groups that are there, so that you use that as the platform from which to move forward. So you know what people want, and that getting to that level of honesty can be uncomfortable and really difficult, but you want to get to an honest place. So I want to thank everyone who is in my group for participating and bringing their diverse perspectives and thought energy. Thanks very much.
Awesome. We're basically on time, actually. So yay. Thank you, everyone. Today was great. And tomorrow, bring your questions. And I think that's it. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks very much. We are going to shift the schedule slightly to give a high-level overview of the National Adaptation Strategy and address some of the comments and questions around the insurance industry. We did like a Google level search, but we'll sort of share the base information of what we found for anyone who's still listening. And those who aren't, if you come tomorrow, it'll happen for you. So it'll be fine. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. Great session today.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, I can't make it tomorrow, but I thank you all so much. It's been really wonderful to be able to participate and meet you all and that kind of stuff. So hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, we feel the same.